President Bashar al-Assad 48 hours to abide by the United Nations peace plan or face consequences. Now, this came just a short time ago after the UN Security Council met behind closed doors in New York, where they were briefed by Deputy Secretary General Kofi Annan, who said the uprising is unlikely to stop without negotiations between the government and the rebels. U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Susan Rice told our own Andrea Mitchell just in the last hour why the U.S. is reluctant to use military force to reach a solution here.
The best way to resolve this, if at all possible, is not through intensifying the militarization, not by providing further arms into what is already a hot conflict. For this to become a proxy war with countries all over the region and beyond funneling weapons in there is basically conceding a massive fire burning in that region.
Meantime, Syrian activists now say they found the bodies of 13 people shot to death execution style. That they were Army defectors. And joining me now is General Barry McCaffrey, MSNBC military analyst, Joel Rubin, a former official with the State Department in political military affairs, and Bobby Ghosh, deputy international editor for Time magazine. Bobby, I'll start with you. Ambassador Rice went on to say part of the problem with the notion that you would arm the rebels in Syria is that unlike Libya, they're not quite clear who these rebels are, and even with Libya, they were not given arms to fight against the regime there.
Well, we may not be very clear who these people are, but we have allies who know them very well. The Turks, the Saudis, the Kuwaitis, the Qataris are in very close contact with the rebels, and they have a pretty decent idea who the good guys are and who the bad guys are, and we need to be able to trust them. And the Libya situation doesn't really work here because nobody at this point is suggesting that NATO should be flying over the Syrian skies and landing bombs on Assad's tanks, that situation.
But they're suggesting that they should be armed, which is a part of, for example, Governor Romney's criticism of the president and the administration's decision here.
I think that ship has already left port. I mean, they are already being armed. They're being armed, as I said, by the Turks, the Saudis, and so on. The question is whether the U.S. is going to get involved in that process or whether it's going to allow its allies with a wink and a nod to continue to do that. The rebels have already showed they have access to weapons and they are beginning to use them. And there are some elements within who are taking advantage of all this confusion and allowing Al-Qaeda to come in and conduct its suicide bombing operations. So if the U.S. does not have a seat at that table, then it has no control over the situation.
Joel, let me bring you in. I want to read part of the headline from the New York Times regarding this. It says that Israeli Defense Minister Ehud Barak praised the U.S. and other countries for ousting Syrian diplomats, but says it was not sufficient, declaring the massacre of 100 people in Hula compel the world to take action, not just talk, but action. We're hearing a lot of that, but obviously there's no clear line leading to what action is appropriate or that would do the most good at this point, which is obviously saving lives. That is the ultimate good here.
Thank you, Cameron. The ultimate good is saving lives, and the approach that the administration is taking, which is ratcheting up the pressure, working with our allies in the region, working to bring the UN along, Russia and China as well, who have key leverage inside of Assad's regime. This is the best approach, and it's an approach that's going to take time. But as Bobby just mentioned, there are weapons flowing to the rebel groups, but it's unclear who they are and how they're operating. So we need to make sure that any steps we take going forward helps to squeeze the Assad regime, helps to build international pressure and isolation against them, and to force a change there inside of Damascus. But military action by the U.S. is very undesirable, and frankly, it's not at all clear how it could be effective.
General McCaffrey, there was a little bit of dust-up after the Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman General Martin Dempsey was on air, and he said basically that it may come to a point with Syria, referring to military intervention. The administration came back out and said basically, whoa, we're not at that point. But nevertheless, we know that this is always, it seems, in these situations where the road leads for some.
Well, no question. I assume the administration actually found his comments helpful because in the background, you got to remind yourself, Damascus is barely more than 50 miles from the Mediterranean, the U.S. naval carrier battle group. So the military option is there. I would assume in 6 months or less, with a modest application of air power, special ops, covert action, we could probably accelerate bringing this murderer down. The real questions, however, are political. what would become of it. And by the way, what are we going to tell the American people, since there's clearly no vital national security interests at stake with an unknown outcome? So the administration, I think, is probably doing all they can to ratchet it up. Unilateral intervention, perhaps with the Turks taking part, ill-advised at this point.
Bobby, you take issue with at least some of what the general just said.
Oh, I'm not really. I think I agree with his basic point, which is that military intervention is not an option at this point. I think it's probably not an option at any point for the United States. But it's important for us not to forget, we're not without friends here. We have friends in the region. Turkey has a big role to play. The Arab League has a big role to play. And it's not simply about applying pressure on Assad. There are other places to apply pressure. There's pressure to be applied on Russia. Vladimir Putin is going to Germany and France this week. He'll be speaking to the leaders of the French and the German people, who will be telling him pretty much what Washington wants him to hear, which is that you can't keep backing this guy. You've got to cut him loose. The stakes are very high, and so the U.S. can't afford to sit back and say, well, a military option isn't on the cards, and therefore there's nothing else we can do, and we're going to outsource this to the UN. There are many other things that can be done.
And Joel, to Bobby's points, the stakes are high. The complexity in all of this, you cannot even, I believe, describe adequately to most people. I want to read this tweet of all things that went out a short time ago. Russia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs says, given international efforts towards a settlement in Syria, some Western countries' decision to expel Syrian ambassadors is counterproductive. Obviously, we know the importance of Russia in all of this, but we cannot, yet again, look at a country and look at it in terms of, do we intervene with the military or don't we? The complexities of Syria, again, are beyond what I believe most people could ever understand there.
This goes to the point of diplomatic sensitivities. Russia is a key player in ensuring that Assad will go and will stop the slaughter. So we need to rein in Russia and work with them to get that accomplished. But clearly they're sensitive to past military intervention on Libya, which was the right call, but nonetheless has raised concerns. But the administration isn't standing by idly. They're continually meeting with the regional neighbors. They're continually supporting the outside activities of the Friends of Syria. And they are designing ways for a diplomatic program that actually facilitates not only Assad's departure, but the day after. We have to remember there would be and will be a day after if Assad goes, and we need to make sure that the country does not implode into a further fall apart civil war. So that's key.
Quickly, General, I want to read, Mitt Romney was on Fox today. He said that the world looks to America to lead. We've been sitting on the back burner hoping something would happen to make it attractive to the world, but frankly what's happening in Syria is unacceptable, and I think they'll continue a posture of leading from behind. Does that help at all the situation when you hear not just a presidential candidate certainly, but anyone at this point in leadership describing the situation in those terms?
Well, clearly it's a time for restrained voices. Look, at the end of the day, Assad, the key to this whole issue isn't Iran or Russia or China. It's Assad and a 12% of the population, Alawite, fighting for their survival and wondering what will happen to them if they lose power.